Week 4, Teach and Share, Introduction to Contracts with my mom again. So, do you know what the definition of a contract is?
It's an agreement between two people, and it's usually a legally binding document.
You are correct. So, it's an enforceable agreement created when two or more party or people agree to do or not to do certain acts. But not all agreements are contracts. Do you know what qualifies for it to be a contract?
If it's legally drawn up.
Yep, when it is legally drawn up, or in this other case, legally enforceable. So contract law is dealing with the law around contracts. So this is based on the idea that our legal system will promote our rights when it comes to contracts. So furthermore, state and federal courts will protect our rights when it comes to a contract, let's say with a neighbor, family member, business, just like it will under the U.S. Constitution. And it is necessary to enforce contract law to promote fairness and push our economic engine. And I didn't know all that before. I was kind of like, oh, well, that makes a lot more sense now than knowing that. So elements of the contract, there are 3 basic ones. So it's offer, acceptance, and consideration. So when it comes to the offer part, it's a key part. It's like a big part of it. So it consists of the offerer, which is the person who sets the terms and conditions, and the offeree, the one who accepts it. To be valid, it has to be serious, which means no jokes and opinions won't be considered serious contracts. Won't be considered contracts. So if it's serious, would a reasonable person consider it legitimate?
You would think.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder.
Sometimes it's not. Sometimes people disagree. So after they've signed the contract.
Yes. Yeah. Also not considered an offer is offers that are made in anger or overexcitement, statements of future intent, or preliminary negotiations. Also, when it comes to the offer part of the contract, the terms and conditions, all of that has to be clear and definite. So that means you have to be like A, B, C, D. It can't be like gray areas, kind of wish-washy.
Can the other person counteroffer?
It can be counteroffered, but then it doesn't become a contract because the counteroffer negates it, which is something that I can explain in just a second. So to enforce it, for it to be enforceable by the courts, they have to be able to establish what the terms are. So you have to have the identities of both parties or both sides, subject matter of the contract, and the consideration to be paid. So, and you have to communicate to the other person. If you don't communicate, they don't know if they can accept it or not. So acceptance goes into more of the agreement of the offeree to the terms and conditions sent by the offerer. So this is voluntary. Offeree by acceptance creates the contract and it will be binding. You have to, again, communicate clearly. Silence normally is not accepted, but there are rare occasions if you've had prior meetings, prior things happening, that the courts will say, okay, this is okay in acceptance if there's silence. So consideration is the next element. So this is what each side gets in exchange for finishing the responsibilities under the agreement. So whatever, I do this, I get this. You do this, you get this, kind of thing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's basically a motivation for a party or side has entered the contract. It's also known as quid pro quo. And I didn't know what the actual definition of that was. Like I've heard it before. So it's basically this for that. You do this, you get that. So the consideration will consist of a promise to do something that one side has no duty to do, or performance of action that one side is not obligated to perform, or refraining from doing something that one side has the right to undertake. So courts don't normally question whether or not consideration is adequate. The law will also recognize that people must be allowed to enter into agreement that they deem fair at the time when the contract was entered in. So we are able to freely enter contracts even if it's not totally fair, but if it's one-sided, it's all for one favor, one party, the court can look into it to make sure that if one side was misled, the contract becomes fraudulent. So that's where the problems come in. If this is all one-sided, this person got more, or whatever the case is. There is, though, the point where contracts can lack consideration, but doesn't usually happen. Usually consideration is a big part of it too. And again, courts won't enforce a contract when actions or events that have already occurred, or illusory promises, which are basically promises that express uncertainty, so they're not kind of real promises, they're just kind of fake. So, types of contracts. Did you know that there was different types of contracts?
Yeah.
I knew there were different, but I didn't know. So there's bilateral versus unilateral. So bilateral is an agreement where a promise is given in return of promise and will become real when the commitment occurs. Unilateral is a promise for an act. So you do this, you get that. So another type is expressed versus implied contracts. So in express contracts, terms are fully and clearly stated and are usually oral or written. Mm-hmm. Implied is based on the conduct of those involved, or its implied conduct. Elements that the courts will use to determine if it is implied is that the plaintiff provided some service or property, plaintiff expected to be paid for that service or property, defendant knew or should have known that the payment was expected, and the defendant had an opportunity to reject the services or property and then didn't. And then the last one is quasi contracts, which are not real, they're fake, and they're contracts to avoid wrongdoing or injustice. And quasi is Latin for as if. Also, when one side provides a benefit on the other with no contract, I can't read this. When one side provides a benefit on the other with no contract, whether it is due to error or defect contract, one side might be unjustly enriched. So one side might get more, and the other one doesn't get enough. So this is when it gets to the part of now we know the contract, we know what the types is interpreting the contracts. So reasons that can be varied as to why interpreting contracts are hard, but a lot of the time it comes down to, it could be laziness, because it's so easy to cut and paste, or you use previous language from a different case that may fit this, contract. So when courts are interpreting this, they will do so by the plain language rule. So this is language interpreted by using ordinary and contemporary meaning. That doesn't mean that there won't be vague clauses, because there are going to be vague clauses, and sometimes in contracts. So when intent can't be determined, or the term can't be interpreted using different ways, that is where the vague clause comes in. So when it can't be interpreted, the court will go against those who drafted it. So if somebody drafted it and did it incorrectly, didn't give enough information, the court's going to go, no, you don't get whatever you're asking for. The termination of an offer or termination of the contract. Do you know what would cause terminations to happen?
If there's dishonesty,
yeah,
and if it's not done according to the laws of the state or the country.
Mm-hmm. So it can be revoked. So that means that the offeror takes it back before the offeree can accept. Like they go, wait, no, this isn't a good idea. I changed my mind. I'm not going to offer this to you. Another reason is termination by actions of the offeree. So asking for additional information won't terminate it, but countering offering will terminate it because it switches the roles. So the offerer.
So you can't counter after you've accepted, but you can counter before that time, right?
You can ask for additional information, but once you make that counter offer, the roles switch. So the offerer becomes the offeree, and the offeree becomes the offerer. So it switches it, kind of null and voids it, nixes it. It's contracts are very complicated in interpreting and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair.
So it's also referred to as the mirror image rule. So if the acceptance does not mirror the offer, it's counter offer. So termination by lapse of time. So offers can only remain open for a reasonable amount of time, and that can vary between each case. Some will be longer, shorter, whatever it is. If it says we'll be open for a specific amount of time, like a year, a month, we'll go based off by what that is, if it specifically states in the contract. And lastly, the big one that they talked about was destruction, death, or illegality. So if the subject matter is ruined, destroyed, damaged, that automatically terminates it. Or somebody dies, or illegal. Something becomes legal. The act becomes legal, whatever the case is. So I thought it was interesting because I'm like, okay, well, this makes a lot of sense, but then at the same time, I'm like, I see where loopholes are happening too. So it's just kind of general, this is where we're at, this is where we're standing. You know, it goes into defense of contracts is where you learn additional things. So this is interesting because I was learning about this week. And on the flip side, again, always my international politics class or my international business, it all ties in. So this week specifically, in my international politics, we're all talking about trade agreements, everything like that. I'm like, well, there you go. There's technically a contract. We've got two countries come together, or other instances where they come together to form a contract, and it's tying in, again, to business law. But I thought it was interesting, and just wanting to be in the event planning business, I kind of need to know what contracts are.
Yeah, for sure.
I was like, well, this is a good thing I learned about this because I knew very little, but did you learn a lot?
Yeah, I did.
I did too.
Yeah, I did.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.